Hey everybody, this is Tuesday Morning Grind, episode number 42. Today we have with us Steve Dotson. Steve is the CISO at Acoustic, investor and mentor at Silicon Valley CISO Investments. Prior VP of Security at Pindrop, long storied background of security leadership at a lot of great companies. And I would argue, most importantly, two-time client of Risk 360. So you liked it so much you came back twice. So thanks very much, Steve, for being here. I'm excited about this conversation.
All right, appreciate it.
So I thought a great way to kind of start it off would just be talking about your background. Like, as just kind of browsing LinkedIn, you went from security architect roles all the way up to security leadership. Can you kind of give us the backdrop there? How'd you get to the leadership position?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm unique in that I stayed on the technical side for probably the first 10 of my 20 years. Was a security engineer, did some networking, wrote some code for a year at a web startup back in 2000, because that's what you had to do in 2000 was be at a web startup. Then I went in telecom for a little bit, did a telecom startup in 2001, which for those of you that were around, did the same thing the web industry did. And so I rode both of those kind of into the ground, but, working at companies like that, being an early engineer, just that environment, I think I just got really attached to being able to affect change so quickly. And I think that's how I ended up in security in general. Is with networking, you're never done, but in writing code, you're never, done, but, those are, specific areas of technology. So in security, we get to learn everything, and just not have to own everything. So you get exposed to all the technology, but more from a security standpoint. I just kept doing architecture. I had a few direct reports in some of those roles, but was looking to learn more on the program side. Technology is ever changing, but I worked for Phil Agquilli, who's here in Atlanta, as his architect. And I just started asking him, hey, can I own the risk framework? He's like, sure. Hey, can I do the control mapping? So I got exposed to some of the program things. I think I even did the budget one year, which, security architect's a vague role anyways, but I was doing more program stuff. And then I parlayed that into my first director of security role under Mark Gibaldi at Travelport. Who took a chance on me as well. So like anybody, a little bit of luck, a little bit of hard work.
Yeah.
I think because of all my startup experience and building architectures, I really have always sought out building programs. I just like kind of being the first one there and building something from nothing. Travelport was a $2 billion company with no security program, merger of three companies. So I've been lucky to do program build outs, and that's very rare, I'm sure, but I've been lucky to do some program build outs at some different, large companies, startups. I'm at a private equity backed carve out right now, which has its own challenges. So, yep.
Yeah. So Steve, when I met you, you were building out a program at Pindrop over there, and we were working on ISO together. And now you're kind of doing that again at Acoustic, or at least, restructuring the program, building it out. So, and you seem really good at it. From an outsider's perspective, as I walk in, it seems like every time we talk, you've made pretty significant progress in rallying the troops and making things happen. So talk about what is your first 30, 60, 90 days? Is there an observation period? Are you doing risk assessments behind the scenes, building out a team? What are the things you're doing as a leader, building out a security program for the first time at companies like this?
Yeah, and because I've done it 4 or 5 times, I feel like a consultant coming in. But I think that's probably the right mindset, is to come in and just not make any assumptions. So I do have kind of an approach, I guess, starting with the output. So the executive team that's there may not even know what a formal security program looks like. So often when you're the first, exec, whatever, manager, somebody's doing security. Maybe it's a few people in IT, part-time, maybe it's some folks in the dev team, doing code scans, but there's really no formal program. And it's interesting how each of the executives, depending on their role, has a different lens that they view security. So their view of what a formal security program is based on their own environment. So the chief product officer is looking at application security and security of products. The legal team, has the privacy lens and compliance. So each executive. So one of the first things I do is do like a high level service catalog, which, here's the services, all of them. And it surprises a lot of people when you see all of the things that a formal security program has to cover. You know that because you look at the control frameworks. But, even though laptops are running AV and there's a firewall, things like vendor risk management, incident response, business continuity, some of those things that make a complete program are not what everybody would think of first if they don't do it for a living. So
what's your sense for, so like, I think there's different ways to look at security as you're kind of talking about. There's like, some people see it as a very technical problem. Some people see it as a compliance problem. What is your starting point with executives? Because you're going to do things like ask for budget, want to build a team. Where's your starting point? Is there enough context now that like most executives get it and you can kind of skip the step of why security is important? Or is there still like making business cases, trying to gain trust and tell them why this is important? Where's the starting point for you with executives?
I think at the beginning, you still have to explain what the program is, and then you have to build support for it, because even though there might be a few part-time people doing security, there's no team, right? There's no budget. You're creating that for the first time. A lot of times it depends on the executives. So in my current role, chairman of the board was at RSA 3 or 4 years ago when they had their issue. So, if you have someone on the board, an executive team, that right or wrong has been through an incident, nothing like a good incident for people to start caring. That usually helps, but you still have to define what the program is. You still, just like every other department, have to go fight for budget and headcount. So the service catalog is the beginning. So once I define, it's like 15 or 16 domains of security, you would recognize them. But I do that to show the breadth of the program, because a lot of times execs don't understand, all of that's included. And then I do a risk maturity assessment. It's a little subjective because I need to get that done really quick, because that's foundational for everything else. That's usually in the first 30 days. I'll meet with the executives, understand where the maturity is in those different areas. And then I combine that with the risk view. So if you have low maturity and business continuity, but that's not with COVID, it's more important to all of us, right? In fact, I was only at Acoustic for a week when COVID hit. So we're BCP, right or wrong, it's not usually the first thing I work on. It was the first thing I had to work on because of COVID. But so once you have that maturity and risk assessment, that drives your roadmap. So now you can say, here's what I'm going to focus on. Here's the projects I'm going to work on. And until you have that, it's hard to really define what the cost and headcount needs to be. So those are the deliverables, I would say, for my first 30, 60, 90. And I get a lot of mileage out of those. That's useful for the next 3 to 6 months with the executive team, with the board.
So basically you're saying, hey, this is the universe of security, 16 domains, a lot of stuff people don't have visibility into because they're thinking like product or whatever. But you said, look, this is big. You do your risk assessment, your maturity assessment, and then you can kind of start painting a roadmap and say, hey, look, this is where we need to work on that'll really move the needle. How much of that, so like while you're doing that, I feel like there's a little bit of art behind being an executive. Like how many lunches, coffees, side conversations to like build trust and to like, all the soft skill stuff are you doing at the same time to like forge alliances and build the trust with the executive team?
And that's why, the risk assessment, maturity assessment, those are executive meetings. So I meet with every single executive, learn what they're doing, what's their remit, because their title isn't always what they actually do. So I use that opportunity to introduce myself, also learn what their concerns are. In some cases, if it's IT or dev, they're doing some of that security. So I can kill a few birds with those meetings, introduce, give them some of my background goals, but then learn what their concerns are. And so by listening to their concerns, you're you're implicitly building that relationship and that trust. And then in some cases, they own parts of security. So in the old days, right, the firewalls, AV, we would own all of that. So some of those skills weren't always so important, but most of us are converting into more of an assurance and compliance function. So if you look at all the controls, this from helping us, prepare for ISO and SOC 2, if there's 200 controls in that universe, we may own only 50 or 60. So you're so dependent on other teams to be successful. So if they own half the controls, right? DevOps, Dev, IT, engineering, HR, legal, then you're dependent on those relationships to be successful, especially the technical relationships to get things done like patching and all the hygiene stuff that it is so challenging to get prioritized.
Yeah, one of the things we did when we're doing like a vCISO gig is we came up with this. It sounds kind of old fashioned, but we came up with a RACI diagram that was like, here's everything that we can think of that involves security and who owns it, who's responsible, who's getting informed, all that good stuff. And then what you find after you go through that exercise is security is loosely involved in everything, but owns not that much, especially when you think about like DevSecOps and they're doing vulnerability scanning and web app firewalls. Legal owns contracts and, all over the place. So it's just such a entangled environment that it's a group effort is the bottom line. So you got your roadmap. You always also do a good job of two things. One, building a team, like structuring it. Both times I've worked with you, the structure of the team made sense. They weren't identical, but they made sense in the unique circumstance. And you were actually able to build a team, which means in the background, you were making a business case for getting resources and doing that in some logical way. So first question, what's your thought process when you go to like structure a team in terms of like who's going to be working on what, how you want to structure it, who's reporting to who? Are you writing it down? Are you going off a playbook?
It's a little experience. And the reason teams sometimes look differently, you mentioned, legal and, dev and engineering teams. I'm a big fan of putting functions where they belong. Less friction. People that own stuff tend to be more interested in getting it done. So the list of services that I have in my team, sometimes there's negotiation. Good example at Acoustic, and it's tricky being the first one there because things are usually happening somewhere else and may not quote belong there. Yeah. So, security monitoring is a great example. So that was being done at Acoustic. It was buried in the dev team, which makes sense. And I pulled that back into my team after a few discussions, because if I'm accountable for the security of the company, then, monitoring and incident response to me is an important capability to have. But then AppSec, based on the Acoustic devs team's maturity in that area, we decided to embed that in their team, where I've owned that in previous orgs. So some of this is just negotiation. If you have a formal procurement team, sometimes some of the vendor, risk stuff ends up somewhere else. So that once I establish, and again, things change 6 months later when new executives show up. So once I establish that phase one list of services, and I can kind of figure out what the team structure should be and how many people, it's hard to go in, it's impossible to go in asking for 10 or 20 people in a company of 500 people. I mean, no matter what Gartner says, it's really challenging. So I think that's where the roadmap is so effective. So if you come in and say, I've got to do all 50 projects, the first year, that's its own challenge. So if you can use your risk assessment to show that, okay, here's all the things I have to do in the next 12 to 24 months. Here's the things I really need to do in the next 3, and here's the staff I need to do that. Then you're showing your fiduciary responsibility and gaining that trust. And then as long as you deliver, then it's a lot easier to go back and ask for additional resources. I also leverage partners, like yourself. Got partners that do incident response plans, BCP. I think depending on your budget environment, and private equity backed companies have their own approach to that, as opposed to startups who wait for funding rounds. You just have to be cognizant of that. So I think using partners at the beginning is a big win as well.
Yeah, budgeting is always funny when it comes to security, because I've seen two approaches. I've seen one where security has a formal standalone budget, but I think what I'm seeing more commonly is that security's budget touches everybody else's budget. And for example, if you think of things like endpoint device management tools, is that an IT budget item or is that a security budget item? If you think about secure source code development, is that engineering budget or is that a security budget? So what have you seen be effective when you're thinking about like expenditures? I need third parties, I need tool sets, I need people. And you mentioned there's some negotiation happening, but is it largely in collaboration with other departments and encouraging them to make those acquisitions, or is it a budget that you own?
I've seen both, and part of that is following your CFO's guidance. In fact, I reported to CFOs in my previous two roles. How they want to. They all have to follow the rules, but private equity is a great example. There's some money you can spend standing up a new company that goes in a different bucket. So no matter where it lands, I think it's important to have that roll up done. So what I'll usually do is work with the finance team to find all the security spends. It's fine if that spend stays in dev's budget. That's a negotiation. But I like to put the money where the owner is. AppSec tools, source code scanning. If the dev team is running and managing those, there's no reason to have that in my budget. But I think showing that complete spend is important. As far as pushing other teams to do stuff, I think that's where a lot of us are catalysts for things. So good example, if your company is not doing source code analysis, just to pick on that, at the end of the day, security doesn't want to own that, nor should they. But if your dev team's not doing it and you see the need, then sometimes our teams have to be the catalyst for it. I call it like the program manager. Bring them along for the ride, but bring the vendors in, sell the value to the dev team, find a few champions to attend the meetings, get it up and running, and then just kind of hand it off to the dev team, and maybe the budget moves with it.
Yeah, one theme that I've seen with your leadership style and other good security executives is, and maybe this is common across all executive positions, but while security is the discipline, it seems like the secret sauce is in the business acumen. And you've already mentioned a few things, like understanding the budgeting process and the CFO's expectations, understanding how to align to business objectives. If you're giving advice to other, up and coming security folks, what do you think the balance of being a technical SME and having strong leadership and business acumen skills are as you rise up through the ranks?
I think some of that is dependent on the company. I tend to gravitate toward tech companies. And so in order to influence those technology teams, you kind of have to have some of those chops, I think, or have someone on your team. It doesn't have to be the CISO. And maybe at a more formal organization, the business acumen is more important. But I've got plenty of scars. I had to, coming from the technical side, everything was a technical solution. So luckily I had a few opportunities to kind of transition into that. And nothing like getting your first security executive role to figure that stuff out, sometimes the hard way. But I think it's a business role. I just happen to focus on security.
Yep. Compliance. You mentioned already that compliance is becoming, I think for all companies, a larger slice of the pie over time for many reasons, just because the assurance, the trust between third parties, especially for like SaaS companies, tech companies who are largely B2B. Talk about your approach to compliance and how much of your day does compliance activities take up as compared to, like, say, traditional security activities? Although there's obviously an overlap.
Yeah. I'm seeing startups go do SOC 2 Type 2s, 12 months after starting. I think, deploying in the cloud and some of the shared responsibility helps that. You don't have as much, you can carve out AWS's SOC 2 and just focus on your responsibility. Plus the company is not as large. But yeah, it's, take Acoustic, for example. So Acoustic is a carve out. I was, I think, employee 40. In March of last year. And then a month later, 1,000 IBM employees moved over. So now you've gone from a startup to a mid-sized company. Plus, when we acquired the marketing assets from IBM, we also acquired 2,000 existing customers that all have, banks and some very mature companies. Their expectation of security is up here. They don't have time to wait. So we had to get mature extremely fast. I was behind before I started. So that's why we moved so quickly. And some of the pieces were there. It was just kind of pulling it together into a formal program, filling some of those gaps and then going for ISO and a type 1. Whereas at Pindrop, the program could kind of grow with the company. So startup sounds fast, but I mean, it's compared to like a PE company or a merger, the expectations kind of grow as the program grows. So I've done them both ways, but yeah, compliance is huge. Building customer trust. My last 5 roles have been in vendors selling to, these same banks and retail. And so I spend a lot of time focused on customer trust. It's a huge part of my role. Meetings and questionnaires and conference calls and emails, continuing to help with the revenue stream. So security being a cost center, any opportunity I can take to help on the revenue side is good.
Yeah, that's a unique phenomena to like tech companies generally, especially startups, especially SaaS companies, is that security isn't just that call center. It's key to revenue generation because you're not going to go do business with Bank of America unless you can speak to a pretty solid security program. And you've been involved, as an employee of some startups and tech companies, but also as an advisor and investor to those tech companies. How conscious are founders or tech companies of the fact that security is mandatory for the acquisition of new clients? Is this come as a surprise, do you see, or is this kind of a natural fact for these companies?
It's definitely trending toward, more awareness that it has to happen. I'm trying to think of a SaaS company that isn't processing at least somewhat sensitive data. Yeah. Right. So if you're going to manage that type of data, I've seen a few companies get surprised by that when they go after their first big customer. But I think it's just the cost of doing business in today's world.
What about privacy? Because I see, you think CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, most folks are going to think security, but I'm seeing this trend of, between legal and between the security team, there's the shared responsibility of thinking about privacy and also additional certifications to demonstrate privacy and all that comes with it. Are you seeing any trends when it comes to privacy in your world?
I mean, we get pulled in a lot. It really depends, back to that negotiation of who's doing what with my peers. It really depends on the general counsel that I'm working with. And that can change in several cases where a GC has come and gone. The new person has a completely different view and I'm handing stuff back to them. So, with the older privacy regs like EU 94, 95, those were more about protection. And so the security team was always behind the scenes owning the controls. With some of the new regulations, it's more about, consent and right to forget. And those, I think, are trending back toward the legal team driving those because they're less about, encryption at rest and protections. They're more about legal. But we have to be experienced in it. In fact, the legal teams are usually even smaller than the security team. So if we're interfacing with customers, we have to normally speak to, GDPR and CCPA and privacy protection. So I think it's something, not all of your security folks need to be experienced in it, but at least your compliance and risk folks have to. I think it's a requirement now.
Yeah, we're seeing either the legal team or the security team hiring folks charged with privacy compliance.
Yep.
Which is I think indicative of how important that is in the marketplace. The fact that people are adding full-time resources to deal with that, because they're seeing things like ISO 27701 or GDPR or CCPA, all the different state regulations. So that's an interesting trend. I speculate it's probably only going to get bigger just because all the regulations that are coming out.
I believe some of my peers are actually DPOs, data protection officers, depending on where they sit in the org, because then the legal team isn't independent of that. So that's interesting.
Yeah. You mentioned that you started Acoustic a week later COVID-19 hit. I think tech companies on average were more equipped to deal with that than others, because largely they were somewhat remote anyway. They probably had the infrastructure in place to let employees work remote. And then if you're a large company where everyone came to the office all day, it was, that was a brand new capability. How did that impact how you spent your time? Was it like all hands on deck? We got to let people work remote. What was that whirlwind like?
So we had two things going for us, I guess. One is this was a carve out from IBM, and if you've ever worked with IBM, their employees are everywhere. Mm-hmm. Like literally 50 different cities. The 1,000 or so people that came over from IBM as part of the acquisition were everywhere anyway. So that helped us quite a bit, as our employees were used to working remotely. And then we're a tech company. So like you said, the culture is usually a little more amenable to that. I was literally there 4 days in an area here in Atlanta. We were on fold up tables while our floor was being built out. So no one's even seen we've got a brand new office. It's gorgeous. I've been there twice, in 15 months. So I think a lot of companies are reassessing, real estate and things like that. From a security perspective, though, because it was so remote first anyways, it wasn't really a big change for us.
Did you see any, as far as like types of phishing campaigns or like upticks in attacks or types of attacks amongst you and your peers? Have you heard or seen anything yourself that changed in terms of like new or developing risks?
I definitely think it increased. I think if you look at the Verizon report and some of the other reports out there was an increase. Now, is it just an increase because there's money to be made and more people are focused on it, or was it COVID? It's hard to tell the causation, but we had a rash of COVID related phishing that first few months. In fact, I still use those in my awareness training because some of them were actually pretty effective. Anywhere there's a way to make a buck, the fraudsters are going to latch onto that.
So I want to shift gears just a little bit, because you have some background in investing and also being part of startups. And one of the questions I get from founders and teams as they're thinking through security, they're either thinking about being acquired, they're thinking about acquiring a company, or they're thinking about funding rounds and how security impacts that. And a lot of it's, comes down to dollars and cents. What's the multiple? Does it make financial sense to get those funded? But there is some aspect of security due diligence or security in the factors that could impact valuation. Have you seen any of that? Like as you're mentoring startups or the ones that you've been a part of, how big of a role, if any, does security play?
I think for M&A, it's big. I've seen it really depends on whether security is invited to those discussions. So I've seen plenty of large companies, do M&A, and I don't want to say forget, but the security person gets brought in after the acquisition, and you're dealing with the mess that they just acquired. But I think it's trending up like everything else. I think folks doing those, the teams that are responsible for that, are vetting it. The same way cyber insurance companies are finally vetting the companies and asking at least a few questions, before they insure them. I think M&A is more focused, but it depends on the startup. obviously there's such a huge focus on revenue. It's just revenue, revenue, revenue. And I think it's tricky. And I deal with mostly security startups. So maybe that's
Yep.
why my numbers are different is security companies have to go for those compliance objectives quick because you're dealing with someone's sensitive data. But it is tough to know when to do that. I've seen plenty of companies like, what is that first person you bring in? Do you bring in a compliance person or a security engineer? And, what kind of skill sets do you look for? And when is the right time to bring in, a director or a CISO? Those are tough questions.
Yeah, we get asked all the time, like, people are looking for those milestones. So, like, do I add someone at a certain head count or a certain revenue or whatever? And those are tough questions because we often see like a compliance project manager is a really early hire because, like you said, you're dealing with SOC 2 almost immediately. And the team typically consists of a bunch of engineers, salespeople, and the founder. And someone has to manage the SOC 2 problem. Then other times they want to embed like a security analyst into the engineering team or either spread that job across a couple people. And then adding a CISO, that's when you need that executive at the helm because there's a team to manage. So those are always interesting questions based on kind of the company's revenue model, the business they're in.
And I think it's very dependent on the executives they're sitting at the table and what experience they have. So if they've had security under them before, they're more likely to volunteer that and say, hey, we need to go do this. Or they have a near miss or some type of incident, or there's someone on the board that says, you guys need to cover this area, start hiring for it. I think that's where the impetus comes from.
Steve, how do you get a seat at the table? Like that's often a problem for security practitioners, I find, is either they are IT, so they're not truly dedicated to security. They're kind of also provisioning laptops. That's a different problem. Or they're not getting time with executives or decision makers. They've been kind of siloed, or security is kind of thought of as this redhead stepchild that does technical work. How have you, or what have you seen as an effective mechanism to get a seat at the table as an executive with other executives?
It's funny, all of us want to be at the table, and report directly to the CEO, but I can tell you from experience, that's good and bad. So I tend to make smaller tables. So, you don't, do I need to interface with the sales leader? Sure, because I'm supporting sales and helping with revenue, but there's not a lot of security discussion. So what I'll normally do is just stand up a smaller table, executive risk council, risk and privacy council. And then, it's the half of the executive team that really, makes sense to meet with, GC, CMO, CIO, whatever. And then you can have better discussions, I think, and more focused discussions. And then the board, I think, is where I normally focus. So I make smaller tables below the executive team and then just make sure I have some exposure to the board. The board's either going to pull that meeting, pull me into that and say, we need to meet with cyber, or you can push for that. And I think that can give you visibility with not only your executive team, but the board, who in most cases makes those final decisions anyways.
Yeah, the making smaller table, I've never heard it put that way, but that's almost exactly what we do. So when we come in to build out security programs, especially as a consultant, and this is, I think, not unlike a full-time security person either, is that you can only influence. You don't necessarily have any authority. And the way to influence is we create an information risk council is what we typically call it, but just to get the right folks at a small table so you can let them know why something's important. And then having the business savvy to frame security as how it supports a business objective. Like, for example, you mentioned talking to the sales guy. If they understand that SOC 2 or ISO is a requirement to get through the contracting process with some big client, their ears perk up. That matters to them. And you could take that across, CFO cares about risk or any other area.
I think that's key, is finding out what matters. I think that statement alone is how you build your influence, is finding out what's important Because like I said, sales has their lens, and dev teams, there's different concerns there. And because I spend so much time with customers, I definitely keep metrics on that. So I just presented those to the board, I think a few weeks ago, is they may not even realize how many resources and how much time we're spending building customer trust. So, showing that, number of questionnaires, number of revenue. If the whole company is focused on sales and revenue, then finding ways to attach yourself to that is super helpful.
Yeah, it kind of simplifies it from that perspective. If you're a security person in a startup, revenue matters, so focus on that, and that gives you a lot of ammunition. I've seen other executives be very successful there. So kind of last topic here, you do investing. We talked about that a little bit, but specifically with other security companies. So you're kind of seeing some of these emerging security startups. And then you hear about all this technology. You hear about blockchain, machine learning, AI, decentralization, heuristic monitors, all the buzzwords. Is there anything that's catching your eye in terms of things you're seeing come out that's kind of really moving the needle when it comes to security programs? Or is it more like really still focused on the blocking and tackling?
Yeah, I was going to say it's still the basics. I mean, asset management isn't sexy, but companies like Lucidum and Exonius, I think, have shown it's something I'm still working on at my current role. These things aren't solved yet. The whole SIM space, security monitoring. I'm dating myself, but I've been buying those tools for 20 years, and my analogy is your cable company at home. Like you've only got so many choices, and you have to have something, but nobody likes them. So there's some new companies like Hunter and some other companies that are, but again, security monitoring, incident response, asset management, endpoint protection. Those are just, like you said, those are block and tackle things. So we're all just hoping somebody finds a novel way to do it. We see a lot of companies focused on privacy and data discovery. Knowing where your data is obviously a building block. And again, I think ML. I'm a closet data scientist, so I cringe sometimes when companies mention ML and AI. But I think there are some interesting ways that people are applying that. So API security, even just passwordless authentication, right? It's like the holy grail. There's some companies focused on that. I did attend a conference. It was like security in AI and ML. I just think some of these things are just too early to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, you can look no further than, I'm highly biased in my Prism because we're working on compliance stuff, but we haven't even cracked that puzzle yet. Like you see some tools coming out, like we have Phalanx and there's many others that are just trying to make it less difficult to do blocking and tackling compliance. And we haven't even cracked that. So it just shows you how much room there is.
Yeah, there's still, you've seen all the GRC tools, right? God knows how much a lot of us spend on Archer and tools like that, but they never actually fully solved the problems and the objectives that we were trying to meet. Security it's just interesting. And I'm sure there's other industries like that, but it's amazing how much money we will spend for just these incremental improvements in effectiveness, right? Yeah. Just gobs of money. I don't know of any other, because we're all just worried. You're worried about the incident and risk and meeting your compliance objectives. But it's amazing to me, which makes a lot of space for innovation and a lot of companies to go give it a shot, I think.
Yeah, I read a statistic recently. I think it said by 2025, the loss in crime related to cyber was going to be something like 10 trillion, which put it ahead of the global drug crime industry. And I don't even know whether to believe that. It was from a reputable source. It was one of these IBM or Verizon reports that was reporting this. But when you think about those kind of numbers in perspective, it's that's more than most economies and just crime. So in terms of problems that society and business is facing, that's a whole lot of theft and a whole lot of company loss. So then when you go to acquire a new tool or something, whatever it is for security, it's it makes sense. But it's hard to fathom that big of a problem.
I've seen
It
some
really is.
huge numbers, and again, who knows what the basis for that is, but yeah, a lot of opportunity. I mean, it's a little morbid, but it's I was trying to get one of my kids to go into the field. I mean, there's so many problems still to solve. A little bit of job security, and it's not going away, unfortunately, even in our personal lives, not just enterprises.
Yeah, absolutely. Last thing, we'll leave on a positive note. Steve, very successful security career. If you had to give advice to someone who's kind of launching their career in security, looking to like move up to the ranks, have a great career, what are you advising them to do?
Mm. It's a very broad space. So I would just I had 3 kids. My last one's a sophomore now. So we had 3 kids trying to find, what we just wanted them to find something they were passionate about. Don't focus on the money. So I'm going to sound like a dad here, but I think even for someone coming out of school, there's the audit track, there's compliance, there's pen testing, there's so many things to go work on. AppSec. I would just advise them to try a little bit of everything and find out something they're passionate about. I've seen plenty of people, start off on the compliance track and then switch, or vice versa. So I would just say, try to get exposed to as many of those. We talked about how broad security really is. Yeah. Get exposed to as many things as you can. Try to do a few career days. My first degree was in marketing and sales, believe it or not, way back in the day, because I didn't really know what those people did every day. It just sounded cool. But then once I did it for 6 months, I didn't like it. So try to do a career day or shadow somebody on the thing that you'd actually be doing.
Great advice. Steve, thanks so much for being here. If you are watching this and you like this kind of content, you want to hear from executives, entrepreneurs, security leaders, privacy leaders, you can check out Tuesday Morning Grind on Risk 360's YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube, search for Risk 360. You'll see the Tuesday Morning Grind series. You can also find this on basically any podcast app that you want to listen to. Steve, thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.